In the spring of 1851, somewhere along the fertile Black Belt region of central Alabama, a woman named Catherine Hartley walked into her husband's study at 3 o'clock in the morning and discovered a scene that would destroy 3 lives forever. What she witnessed that night, documented only in a series of sealed letters held by the Mobile Historical Society until 1924, led to one of the most disturbing acts of revenge ever whispered about in antebellum Southern society. 2 human beings bound by law and custom to her will simply vanished from Hartley Plantation within 48 hours. No questions were asked. No authorities were involved. And for nearly 7 decades, the truth of what Catherine Hartley did to her husband and the enslaved man she found him with remained hidden behind the Gentile facade of Southern respectability. Before we continue with the story of the Hartley family and the night that shattered their carefully constructed world, if you're listening from Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, or anywhere in the South, leave a comment telling us what state or city you're from. And if stories like this, real human darkness hidden behind history's closed doors, intrigue you, make sure you're subscribed to my channel, because what we're about to reveal will challenge everything you thought you knew about power, shame, and vengeance in the Old South. The truth is, what happened at Hartley Plantation wasn't supernatural. It wasn't mysterious in the traditional sense. It was something far more chilling. The calculated cruelty of which human beings are capable when their pride is wounded and their power is absolute. Greene County, Alabama in the early 1850s was a world unto itself. The Black Belt, named for its dark, rich soil rather than its population, though both definitions would have applied, stretched across the heart of the state like a prosperous wound. Cotton was king, and those who controlled the land, and the people who worked it lived like royalty of a particularly American kind. The county seat of Utah was a town of wide streets and narrow mines, where Greek Revival mansions stood as white monuments to wealth built on black labor. Hartley Plantation occupied nearly 2,000 acres along the Tombigbee River, its main house, a testament to the family's rise from modest Carolina origins to Alabama aristocracy. Thomas Hartley had purchased the land in 1834 when Alabama was still young and hungry, and over 17 years had transformed it into one of the region's most productive estates. 240 souls lived and worked on Hartley land. Men, women, and children whose names appeared in ledgers as assets rather than people, their value calculated in dollars against the columns of cotton production and birth rates. The big house itself was a 2-story structure of white-painted brick with 6 massive columns supporting a second-floor gallery that wrapped around 3 sides of the building. Inside, the rooms were appointed with furniture shipped from New Orleans and fabrics from as far away as France. Crystal chandeliers hung in the double parlor. Persian carpets covered heart pine floors. A library held more than 400 volumes, though it was unclear how many Thomas Hartley had actually read. Catherine Wilmington Hartley had come to the plantation as a bride in 1842, the 19-year-old daughter of a Charleston shipping merchant who had fallen on hard times. The marriage had been arranged, as most were in their circle, with an eye toward mutual advantage. Thomas needed a wife who could manage a grand household and provide him with heirs. Catherine needed security and status. Love, if it was considered at all, was expected to develop later, a pleasant byproduct of proximity and shared interest. For 9 years, Catherine had performed her role with the precision expected of a woman of her class. She oversaw a staff of 12 house servants, managed the intricate social obligations that came with being mistress of a major plantation, and bore Thomas 2 daughters, Margaret in 1843 and Ellalinina in 1846. She maintained the account books with meticulous care, noting every expenditure from dress fabric to field tools. She planned dinners that lasted 5 hours and featured 7 courses. She smiled at her husband across candle-lit tables and never complained about the essential loneliness of her position. But Catherine Hartley was not, as her Charleston schooling had intended, an ornament. She was intelligent, observant, and though she would never have used the word herself, angry. Angry at the limitations of her sex, angry at her dependence, angry at the way power worked in her world. She had learned early to channel that anger into control, and over the years she had quietly made herself indispensable to the operation of the plantation in ways that went far beyond the traditional mistress's role. She knew every enslaved person by name, age, and skill. She understood the complex web of family relationships in the quarters. She had taught herself basic medicine and personally tended the sick, not out of kindness, but because healthy workers were more productive. She knew which overseers were effective and which were merely cruel. She knew the cotton market as well as any broker in Mobile, and she knew things about her husband that he believed she did not know. Thomas Hartley, at 43, was a man who believed himself to be a success. He had wealth, position, a fine house, and the respect of his peers. He served on the county board of commissioners. He was a deacon at Mesopotamia Baptist Church. His opinions on matters of agriculture and trade were sought and valued. He wore his authority like a second skin, comfortable and unquestioned. But Thomas Hartley had a secret that would have destroyed him, if it were known. Not the kind of secret that men like him sometimes kept. A mistress in town, a gambling debt, a disputed land deal. This was something else entirely. Something that in the Alabama of 1851 carried penalties ranging from social death to actual prosecution under the state's sodomy laws. For more than 3 years, Thomas had been involved in a relationship with a man named Jacob, enslaved on the Hartley property since childhood. Jacob was 28 years old in the spring of 1851, a skilled carpenter who worked primarily in maintaining the plantation's extensive buildings and equipment. He was literate, taught to read in secret by his mother, who had learned from the daughter of her previous owner in Virginia, and possessed of a quiet intelligence that Thomas had first noticed when Jacob was barely 20. How it had begun was a question that would never be fully answered. Perhaps Thomas had sought Jacob out, using his absolute authority to coerce what he wanted. Perhaps there had been some moment of mutual recognition. Two men trapped in different ways by the same rigid system, finding something in each other that their world said could not exist. The truth likely contained elements of both, complicated by the fundamental impossibility of consent when one person literally owned the other. What was certain was that by 1851 they met regularly in Thomas's study, a ground-floor room at the back of the house that opened onto the garden through French doors. Thomas had given Jacob freedom of movement unusual for an enslaved person on the pretext of allowing him to check and repair things around the property at any hour. The other enslaved people knew something, of course. It was impossible to keep such things completely hidden in the close quarters of plantation life, but they said nothing. What choice did they have? Catherine had suspected for nearly a year. Not the specific truth, but something. The way Thomas looked at Jacob sometimes, the frequency with which he found reasons to have the man near the house, the gifts, a better coat, a good knife, privileges that seemed excessive even for a valued skilled worker. But suspicion was not certainty, and Catherine was a woman who dealt in facts. On the night of May 6, 1851, those facts arrived. Oh, evento sombrio. Catherine had gone to bed at 10 o'clock as was her custom. Thomas had remained in his study, claiming paperwork that needed his attention. This too was normal. He often worked late into the night, especially during the planting and harvest seasons. Catherine had read for an hour by lamplight, then extinguished the flame and settled into sleep with the ease of someone whose conscience, if not entirely clear, was at least unburdened by doubt about her own righteousness. She woke at 3 o'clock in the morning, needing to use the chamber pot, and noticed immediately that Thomas's side of the bed had not been slept in. Again, not unprecedented. He sometimes fell asleep at his desk, or if he'd been drinking on the settee in his study. But something made Catherine rise, pull a wrapper over her nightgown, and move silently down the hallway toward the stairs. The house at that hour was a study in contrast. Moonlight through tall windows, creating rectangles of blue-white light against shadow. The tick of the tall case clock in the entrance hall marking time with mechanical indifference. The smell of wood ash from the day's fire still lingering in the air. Catherine moved without her shoes, her bare feet silent on the polished wood. As she descended the stairs, she heard it, a sound that at first her mind refused to interpret correctly. Low voices from the study, masculine voices speaking in tones that were intimate rather than conversational, and then a sound that was unmistakable, a gasp of pleasure that could mean only one thing. Catherine stood frozen on the bottom step for perhaps 30 seconds, her hand gripping the newel post so tightly that her knuckles went white. Later, trying to reconstruct that moment, she would remember thinking very clearly, I can turn around. I can go back upstairs. I can never know for certain. But she was not a woman who could live with uncertainty. Not when the truth was just 20 feet away behind a closed door. She crossed the entrance hall and put her hand on the brass knob of the study door. It turned silently. Thomas kept all the hinges and locks in the house well-oiled, a habit from his own father. She pushed the door open, perhaps 6 in, enough to see into the room. The lamp on Thomas's desk was turned low, casting a golden light that made the scene look like something from a painting, classical, almost beautiful in its composition. Thomas was seated in his leather chair, his head tilted back, his eyes closed. Jacob knelt before him, his dark skin gilded by the lamplight, his hands on Thomas's knees. What they were doing was absolutely clear, undeniable, impossible to interpret as anything other than what it was. Catherine watched for perhaps 15 seconds. Neither man knew she was there. Then she pulled the door shut again silently and turned and walked back across the entrance hall, up the stairs, down the corridor to her room. She closed and locked her bedroom door, sat down on the edge of her bed, and began very methodically to plan. The rage came later. Once the initial shock had worn off, it built slowly through what remained of the night, fed by humiliation and betrayal, but also by something darker, a profound sense of violation that had as much to do with power as it did with marriage. Catherine Hartley had built her life around understanding and accepting her place in the rigid hierarchy of Southern society. She was a woman subordinate to men but superior to slaves. She was a wife bound to her husband but mistress of her household. These rules were absolute, sacred, the very foundation of her world. What she had witnessed shattered those rules. Her husband, who by law and custom had authority over her, had debased himself with a man who by law and custom was property. The transgression was double against nature as their society defined it and against the racial order that made their entire way of life possible. If a white man could desire, a black man could place himself in a position of apparent submission to someone who was legally a slave, then what did that say about the natural hierarchy that justified everything? More personally, more painfully, Catherine understood with sudden clarity that she had been replaced, not by another woman, which would have been commonplace and forgivable, but by a man, and not just any man, but an enslaved man. Her husband had chosen him over her, had risked everything, reputation, position, possibly even freedom, to be with him. What did that make her? What did that make their marriage, their children, their entire shared life? By the time gray light began to show at the windows, Catherine had made her decision. It was not made in haste or passion, though both emotions were present. It was made with the cold calculation that had always been her greatest strength. She would not confront Thomas. She would not make a scene. She would not divorce him. Even if the scandal could be contained enough to allow it, divorce would leave her penniless and powerless, dependent on her father, who had nothing left to give. She would not expose him to the law or to public judgment. No, Catherine Hartley would do something else entirely, something that would serve multiple purposes. It would remove the offense from her sight. It would punish both men in a way that fit their crime. And it would be done so quietly that no one would ever know the real reason. She would make them both disappear separately but together in a way that would destroy them while preserving her own position. She knew exactly how to do it. The question was only whether she had the courage or the cruelty to follow through. The institution of slavery in the antebellum South was built on the principle of absolute power over other human beings. Enslaved people could be bought, sold, traded, given away, or willed to heirs like any other property. They had no legal recourse, no protection from separation from family, no say in their own fate. This was the system that Catherine Hartley had lived within all her life, that she had accepted without question as natural and divinely ordained. Now she would use that system to exact her revenge. The morning of May 7th proceeded with absolute normalcy. Catherine dressed with her usual care, supervised breakfast, spoke pleasantly to her daughters about their lessons for the day. Thomas appeared at the breakfast table at 8 o'clock, looking perhaps slightly tired, but otherwise unremarkable. He kissed his wife's cheek. He asked about her plans for the day, if he had any idea that she had seen him the night before. He gave no sign. Catherine watched him eat his eggs and ham, drink his coffee, read through the mobile register that arrived by mail twice a week. She responded to his comments with her usual measured interest. She poured him a second cup of coffee, and all the while, behind her composed face, she was refining her plan, considering angles, anticipating problems. The key was to act quickly before doubt or mercy could interfere. The key was to make it look like routine business. The key was to ensure that neither man ever had the chance to speak to the other, to coordinate stories, to resist. At 9:30, Catherine excused herself from the morning room and went to find the overseer, a man named Rutledge, who had worked for the Hartleys for 6 years. She found him near the stables, discussing the day's work with 2 of the field drivers. "Mr. Rutledge," Catherine said, her voice carrying the tone of pleasant authority that she had perfected over years of managing a large household. "I need Jacob brought to the house. There's extensive damage to the window frames in the east parlor. I believe we have carpenter ants, and I want it assessed and repaired before it worsens." Rutledge touched his hat. "Yes, ma'am. I'll send him up directly." "Actually," Catherine said as if the thought had just occurred to her, "have him come to the back entrance. No need to track through the front rooms if the work is all to be done on the east side." 20 minutes later, Jacob arrived at the back door carrying his toolbox. He was a tall man, lean and strong from years of physical labor with intelligent eyes that had learned to reveal nothing. He had been born on Hartley property, son of a woman named Rachel, who worked in the kitchen gardens. His father had been sold away before Jacob was old enough to remember him, a common enough story. Jacob had learned carpentry from an older enslaved man named Samuel, now dead, and had become skilled enough that Thomas relied on him for all manner of repairs and improvements. What Jacob felt about Thomas, what he felt about their encounters in the study, was something he kept buried so deep that perhaps even he could not fully access it. Survival in his position meant accepting certain realities. It meant taking whatever small advantages came his way. It meant never allowing himself to fully think about what it would be like to be free, to make his own choices, to love whom he wanted without the shadow of ownership over everything. Catherine met him at the back door herself, which was unusual. Normally, such interactions would be handled by the housekeeper or one of the other house servants. "Jacob," she said, her voice perfectly pleasant. "There's been a change of plans. I need you to take a message to Mr. Turnbull in Utah. It concerns some furniture I've ordered. He was supposed to send word when it arrived, but I haven't heard and I want to check on the status." Jacob hesitated for just a fraction of a second. Taking messages to town was not normally his responsibility. But he was not in a position to question the mistress's orders. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "The wagon is ready for you in the drive," Catherine continued. "I've already had your tools loaded. You'll need to stop at the Dennis farm on your way back and assess some work they want done. I told Mrs. Dennis you might be able to fit them in next week." This made more sense. Jacob was occasionally hired out to other plantations for skilled work with his wages going to Thomas. He nodded, accepting the explanation. What Jacob did not know was that the wagon driver was not one of the regular Hartley people. He was a man named Pierce, hired 3 days earlier from a neighboring plantation, who had been paid extra and given very specific instructions. He did not know that the message Jacob carried was sealed and addressed to a man in Utah who worked as an agent for several of the larger slave trading firms in Mobile. And he did not know that once the wagon left Hartley property, he would never return to it. Catherine watched the wagon pull away. Jacob seated beside Pierce, the morning sun already hot enough to make the dust of the drive shimmer in the air. She felt nothing. No guilt, no doubt, no mercy, just a cold satisfaction that the first part of her plan had been executed. Now for the second, she waited until she saw Thomas heading toward the fields for his morning inspection, another routine that could be counted on. Then she returned to the house and went directly to his study. She locked the door behind her, went to his desk and took out the leather-bound ledger, where he kept records of all the plantation's enslaved people. She found the page for Jacob quickly enough. Age 28, carpenter, healthy, valued at $1,200. Born on property, mother Rachel, deceased 1847, no recorded father. Below that, in Thomas's handwriting, were the words, "Not to be sold. Essential to plantation operations." Catherine took up Thomas's pen, dipped it in the inkwell, and with 3 strokes crossed out those words. In their place she wrote, "Sold to Turnbull and Associates, Utah, May 7, 1851. $1,200. The forgery was perfect. She had been keeping her husband's books for 9 years. She knew every loop and slant of his handwriting. The transaction that took place in Utah that afternoon of May 7, 1851, was on its surface utterly ordinary. Jacob was presented to Mr. Turnbull by Pierce along with a letter bearing Thomas Hartley's signature forged by Catherine explaining that circumstances had forced an unexpected sale and that the transaction should be handled with all due speed. Cash payment was acceptable. Mr. Turnbull, a sharp-eyed man who had been in the trading business for 15 years and had seen every variation of human desperation and calculation, examined Jacob with the practiced eye of someone assessing livestock. He checked Jacob's teeth, his hands for signs of disease, asked him questions about his skills. Jacob answered numbly, still trying to understand what was happening, how he had gone from taking a message to being sold in the space of a single wagon ride. He tried to explain, "There's been a mistake. Mr. Hartley, he wouldn't sell me. He needs me for the carpentry work. You need to send word to the plantation." Turnbull had heard such protests 1,000 times. Everyone thought they were special, that their owner valued them too much to sell them. They never understood that in the end they were all just commodities and circumstances changed. "Boy," Turnbull said not unkindly, "I have a letter here with your master's signature and seal. I have authorization for payment. This is legal and proper and I'll thank you not to make a fuss about it." Jacob was taken to the back room of Turnbull's offices where 3 other enslaved people, 2 men and a woman, sat chained to a wall, waiting to be transported to Mobile. He was shackled alongside them. The door was locked, and there, in the dimness of that hot room with the sounds of Utah's daily commerce filtering through the walls, Jacob began to understand that his life had just fundamentally changed, that whatever he had thought he had with Thomas was not protection, was not safety, meant nothing against the absolute power of ownership. But he did not yet understand the full depth of what had been done to him. That same afternoon, Catherine waited until Thomas returned from the fields, until he had washed and changed for dinner, until the family was seated at the table with the girls chattering about their day. Then, as the first course was being served, she said casually, "Thomas, I handled some business for you today. You've been so busy with the planting, and I know you've been concerned about our cash reserves." Thomas looked up from his soup, attentive but not alarmed. Catherine often handled business matters. "I sold Jacob to Turnbull in town," Catherine continued, her voice perfectly level. "Got $1,200 for him. Full value. The money's in your desk. I thought we could use it to make that payment to Merit for the seed we bought on credit." The color drained from Thomas's face, his spoon clattered against his bowl. For a moment he seemed unable to speak. "You what?" he finally managed. "I sold Jacob," Catherine repeated, meeting her husband's eyes directly. "You've been saying we needed to liquidate some assets. He's skilled enough to command top price, and we have other carpenters in the quarters who can take on his work." It seemed a practical choice. Thomas stood up so abruptly that his chair fell backwards. "You had no right. You can't just. I never authorized." "I'm your wife," Catherine said, still in that same calm tone. "I manage the household, which includes the household accounts. You've given me signing authority on plantation business many times before. I used your seal. Everything was legal and proper." "Where is he?" Thomas demanded. "I'll go to Turnbull right now. I'll cancel the sale. I'll plan to put him on the evening barge to Mobile," Catherine said. "That departed 2 hours ago. By now Jacob is halfway down the Tum River. But if you'd like to ride to Mobile and try to track him down, by all means do so. I'm sure Mr. Turnbull can tell you which firm he sold him on to. There are only about 40 slave dealers operating in Mobile. It shouldn't take you more than a few days to check them all." She paused, then added very softly, "Of course you'll need to explain why you're so desperate to get him back. I'm sure people will be very curious about why one carpenter is so irreplaceable." Thomas stood there trembling with a rage and despair that he could not express. Not in front of his daughters, not in front of the house servants who stood by the walls waiting to clear dishes. He understood in that moment that Catherine knew. He did not know how much she knew, but she knew enough. And she had used the very system that gave him absolute power over Jacob to take that power away. "Excuse me," he said, his voice strangled. "I'm not feeling well." He left the dining room. Catherine heard his footsteps on the stairs, heard the door to his study slam. She turned to her daughters, who were watching with wide, confused eyes. "Your father is tired from the planting," she said pleasantly. "Now tell me more about what you learned in your French lesson today." But Catherine's revenge was not complete. Not yet. Because while Jacob had been sold to Turnbull that afternoon, he had not been put on a barge to Mobile. That was a lie calculated to prevent Thomas from attempting an immediate pursuit. Jacob was still in Utah, locked in Turnbull's holding room. And that evening, after the office had closed and the streets had quieted, Turnbull received another visitor. Her name was Viola Garrison, though she had not used that surname in many years. She operated an establishment in Mobile's theater district, a brothel catering to a specific and highly discreet clientele. While most such houses in Mobile serve the appetites of wealthy white men for enslaved or free women of color, Viola's establishment offered something different. Enslaved men, available for the use of male clients. It was illegal, of course, like all sodomy in Alabama, but it was profitable, and as long as it remained discreet, as long as the right officials were paid to look the other way, it was tolerated. Viola purchased enslaved men from a variety of sources. Sometimes from traders who had men damaged in some way that made them less valuable for field work. Sometimes from owners who suspected their male slaves of tendencies that made them dangerous to keep on a plantation, and sometimes from special arrangements like the one she had with Mr. Turnbull, who contacted her when he came into possession of men who fit her specific requirements. The arrangement Viola had made for Jacob had been negotiated 3 days earlier in a meeting with a woman who had traveled to Mobile under an assumed name. The woman had been very specific about what she wanted. A particular enslaved man purchased and placed in a particular situation. She had been willing to pay handsomely for this service. Not just the purchase price but a substantial fee on top of it. Viola had asked no questions about motivation. She did not need to. Women who made such arrangements usually had good reasons, and those reasons were not her concern. On the evening of May 7th, Viola paid Turnell $1,200 for Jacob, plus his fee for facilitating the transaction. Jacob was loaded into a closed wagon and transported to Mobile, a journey of about 60 miles that would take the better part of a day and a night. He was given water but no explanation. He was kept chained, and when the wagon finally stopped and he was led into a building in Mobile, he found himself in a place that at first he could not quite comprehend. It looked like a house, a large townhouse in one of Mobile's better neighborhoods. But the windows were covered with heavy curtains. The rooms were furnished in a way that was both opulent and somehow tore dry, and there were other men there, enslaved men, who looked at him with expressions that contained pity and a kind of weary recognition. One of them, a man named Samuel who had been there for 2 years, explained it to Jacob that first night. Explained what the house was. Explained what was expected of them. Explained that, however complicated and compromised that connection was, would be forced upon him again and again with strangers, where the thing that in their quiet moments in the study had perhaps contained some fragment of intimacy, however poisoned by the fundamental inequality between them, would become purely transactional, purely degrading. It was a punishment that fit the crime perfectly, at least in Catherine's mind. If Jacob and Thomas wanted to engage in such acts, then Jacob would do so endlessly with anyone who paid, stripped of all pretense of choice or connection. But Catherine was not finished. The final piece of her revenge was still to come. Thomas Hartley spent the next week in a state of controlled desperation. He could not ride to Mobile and search for Jacob. To do so would require explaining why one enslaved carpenter mattered so much. He could not confront his wife directly about what she had done, because to do so would require admitting what she had witnessed. He was trapped in his own secret, pinned by the very shame that had kept him silent all along. He tried to function normally. He oversaw the fields. He attended to business. He spoke to his wife with icy politeness. But inside he was unraveling. The shock of Jacob's sudden absence was compounded by the realization of how completely Catherine had outmaneuvered him. She held all the power now. She knew his secret, and with a word she could destroy him utterly. On May 14th, exactly 1 week after Jacob's sale, Catherine came to Thomas's study after dinner. She closed the door behind her and stood looking at her husband, who sat at his desk with a glass of whiskey, his third of the evening. "I've been thinking," Catherine said, "about our situation, about the future of this family." Thomas said nothing. He could not look at her. "I will never speak of what I know," Catherine continued. "I will never expose you. Our marriage will continue as it has, at least in outward appearance. You will fulfill your duties as husband and father. I will fulfill mine as wife and mother. No one need ever know that anything has changed." "Where did you send him?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "At least tell me that. Is he well? Is he safe?" "He is alive," Catherine said. "That is all you need to know, and it is more than you deserve." She moved toward the door, then paused. "There is one more thing. I've decided we need an overseer with more experience, someone who can take on more of the day-to-day management. I've arranged for Mr. Rutledge to be replaced. His replacement arrives tomorrow." Thomas looked up at her, confused by this apparent non sequitur. "The new overseer's name is Pierce." Catherine said, "You may remember him. He drove the wagon that took Jacob to town. I've purchased his contract from the Danforth Plantation. He'll be living in the overseer's house, and I expect you to give him full authority over all plantation operations." The threat was implicit but clear. Pierce had been part of the plot to remove Jacob. He knew something, even if not everything. He was Catherine's man, loyal to her, watching Thomas. It was another chain, another form of control. "You've thought of everything," Thomas said bitterly. "Yes," Catherine replied. "I have." Nishi left him alone in his study, surrounded by his books and his maps and his ledgers, in the room where he had committed the sin that had cost him everything. And for the first time in his adult life, Thomas Hartley wept. But Catherine's plan had one element that even she had not fully anticipated: the human capacity for obsession. Because Thomas, for all his shock and grief, was not a man who accepted defeat easily. He had built his entire life on the principle of control over land, over labor, over his own carefully constructed public image. The idea that Catherine had simply won, that Jacob was gone forever, and there was nothing to be done about it, was intolerable. Over the following days, Thomas began to investigate quietly. He wrote to contacts in Mobile under various pretexts, asking about the slave markets, about recent sales, about where a skilled carpenter from Greene County might have ended up. He spoke to traveling merchants who passed through Uter. He even, in a moment of particular desperation, considered hiring a slave catcher to simply track Jacob down, though he quickly realized the impossibility of explaining such a request. What Thomas was looking for, though he could not have articulated it clearly even to himself, was not just Jacob. It was the restoration of his sense of power, his sense of control. Catherine had humiliated him by revealing that his secret made him weak, made him vulnerable. If he could find Jacob, if he could somehow undo what Catherine had done, he could reclaim that power. By the end of May, Thomas had pieced together enough information to know that Jacob had been purchased by a woman named Viola Garrison, who operated some kind of boarding house in Mobile. He did not yet know what kind of boarding house, but he knew the address. And on the morning of June 2, 1851, Thomas told Catherine that he had business in Mobile that would require him to be gone for several days. Catherine watched him depart with a cold satisfaction. She knew where he was going. Of course, she had known he would go eventually. Men like Thomas always believed they could fix things, could reassert control, could undo the consequences of their own actions. She had counted on this. What happened when Thomas Hartley arrived in Mobile and found his way to Viola Garrison's establishment on Front Street would become the final act of Catherine's carefully constructed revenge. Mobile in 1851 was a city of sharp contrast. The waterfront bustled with commerce, cotton bales stacked high on the docks, ships from around the world crowded into the harbor, merchants and laborers and sailors moving in a constant swirl of activity. A few blocks,